Hello everyone, I'm Samantha Jane Smith.
And I'm Jacob Cairns, and you are listening to the Classical Queer podcast. Join us as we listen to queer classical music from around the world, talk with composers, and explore the wonderful, diverse, and growing repertoire of LGBTQ musicians.
In today's show, we'll be talking to three young trans and non-binary composers about their work. The three are part of a cooperative in Glasgow who not only make great music, but encourage others in their community to find their voice. The cooperative recently released their first EP and will be playing some music from it today.
Welcome. My name is Jacob Cairns, and I am a conductor and a musicologist. Most of my time as a musicologist is spent studying how queer classical musicians write and perform and create.
Hi everyone, I'm Samantha Jane Smith. I present the Classical Music Show on Trans Radio UK and have been an avid listener to classical music for almost half a century. I should say I have no musical talent whatsoever, so I approach music from the perspective of the average layperson. Let's get straight on with the show. So on today's programme, Jacob and I welcome three fantastic young trans and non-binary composers and musicians who are all featured on a recent EP released by a musical cooperative in Glasgow called Overat. So welcome to Rufus Isabel Elliott, Ryan Gleave and Vivian Holmes. So perhaps we can start by getting you to introduce yourselves. So maybe we'll start with you, Rufus.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Rufus. I'm a composer and musician. I mainly work in classical circles and idioms, but in a way that tries to sort of allow anyone into it and any kinds of voices into it. I founded Overat a couple of years ago and have been privileged to get to work as a producer and curator as well as a composer in this EP.
Fantastic. Rylan, do you want to go next?
Hello, I'm Rylan. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a composer and vocalist and teacher based in Glasgow at the minute. A lot of my practice is quite inclusive. It also focuses on the voice, my own voice, others' voices, facilitating others to use their voices. I'm not a carbon copy of Rufus, I promise. We have different hair.
That's good to hear. Okay, thanks, Rylan. Viv?
Hi, I'm Vivian Holmes. I am, let's say a multidisciplinary artist based in Manchester, just because it's mostly in being indecisive. But yeah, I am the guitarist and back vocals in my band Ethermech. I perform solo work under the name Ocean 1212W after the Sylvia Plath short story. And yeah, I was asked by Rufus, who I knew through uni, to sort of collaborate on this, and I was like, I haven't done a lot of classical things. I'm traditionally my band's a punk band. My solo stuff is more in the metal scene. And, I used to do more classical stuff at school, but it was a bit of a change. And yeah, I do a lot of work with Part Time Collective down here in Manchester. And I sort of do a lot of producing and curating of sort of drag acts and stuff like that, as well as my own practice.
Fantastic, thank you. I must admit, after that, I feel quite inadequate. So let's talk first a little bit about Overat, which is a Glasgow-based collective. And Rufus, you've been a key person within this. So would you like to say a little bit about that and how this EP came about?
Yes. So, Overat is, it started out as a gig series in the distant lands of March 2020. And that first gig at the Glad Cafe in Glasgow was, a really beautiful celebratory evening with, like works that were vocal in a lot of different ways, including not speaking and not singing, as well as, doing both those things and maybe also having a bit of a shout. And that was a really beautiful evening just to see a lot of different ways that we could do that. And then a week later it was the lockdown. And I had, been very fortunate in that first lockdown. I was appointed to, this, sound and music program called Composer Curator, and they were interested in what I was doing with trans voices and wanted to support the series to continue past that first gig. Only it was a pandemic, so the question was how to do that, how to bring people into this music, and in the end the plan sort of grew so variously to include like commissions, recording projects, workshops, writing, learning resources, like all kinds of things. And I was struggling to think like how to describe this, and I started calling it a trans, non-binary and gender diverse music making world. And I think like that idea of the world is like really important, kind of something imaginative, and trying to think like this name Overat was kind of like a joke about, so you know, trans things are always called like transcend, transpose, translate, and we can all have a lot of fun with that. But I was thinking like, what about like the trans part as like in, if you go back to whatever the Greek, I'm sure that someone can show me up here for my lack of classics knowledge, but it's like something over there. So like over there across that glen, something on the other side, something on the mountain over there. So it's kind of like something you can kind of glance at, but like maybe not. Yeah. So that sort of like imaginative place was really important, and like yeah, feeling like with the EP, I had this idea in my own music that I've been thinking about a lot, like sort of just singing as something sort of bodily, that some kind of like a physical response. I've worked on this piece with Rylan called He Lands, Heel Lands, which we made over like more than a year, and we recorded Rylan's voice when his voice was breaking, and like exploring like all those cracks and splinters. And then I played those recordings to some other trans friends, and just like on headphones, people who aren't like experienced in like musical training, and asked them to just sing, to listen and sing. And it was really just so beautiful to hear people use their voices. And I wanted to sort of think more about like, yeah, this EP was kind of a way to ask different people to contribute to that and sort of imagine a sort of broader tradition. So yeah, the idea of like a trans living tradition, and asking some different people into the world to imagine a little corner of it. And that's what the EP kind of is, like all together, all these different little parts of the world. Yeah, like I had this role with the EP of not so much as a composer, but more like taking what I'd learned in my own work and trying to share it on to other artists and ask them to respond. And yeah, Vivian was working with the artist Harry Josephine Giles, who mainly does text-based stuff, but is also a punk musician. So that was quite a sort of happy match. And then Ryland's been really involved with basically everything in Overat, having to get me texting him every 10 seconds being like, Ryland, do you think I should do this? Ryland, do you think I should do that? And Rylan can basically do anything that I can't do. So he's basically done anything in the project that I wasn't capable of. Rylan stepped in and saved the day with like helping with teaching some singing techniques to a group of musicians who aren't normally singers, or maybe have singing as like a part of their work. And he made a lot of the learning resources that we put together, and he actually went down to Manchester to record Viv performing Out of Existence. So yeah, he's kind of
I want to add was a fantastic trip, and that was such a privilege, Viv. You are so talented.
It was great. Also, it turned out that my practice studios were like, we were recording, turned out to be like 2 streets away from where...
My dad's house.
Yeah. Which was great. And yeah, that was a great day. I was having the most absurdly shit day, and then we went to record in the evening, and I was like half an hour late, and I was like battling through the Manchester tram system with like bags full of pillows to like cover things, and it was just a fucking dream. Brian is terrifyingly talented, and yeah, it was kind of lovely.
I think we'll just let you guys talk for the next hour. I'm quite happy just to listen to you chat away, to be honest. I don't know about you, Jacob, but I'll just let them talk. It's just fascinating, really. It's great.
Honestly, I'm so thrilled to not like push people in directions. I'm just happy to hear what you all have to say, and it's so fascinating to talk about. I think you said that we're like creating a whole world or a small corner of the world, and just like where that comes in and what part of your world you bring into all of these different things. And I think, I mean, we'll listen to them, of course, in a second, but one of the things that I wrote down in my like scribbled notes as I was listening to the 3 pieces we're going to talk about is just everyone in their own way creates such a atmosphere, and it's so immersive, and each one of them has a different like architectural understanding of space. And it was so interesting to listen to the heavy text-based ones and then the more soundscape pieces, you know, and just hear what that world brings to me. And it's going to be really fascinating to map my thoughts on it to what you all think about your actual creations and what you were thinking about when you were writing and performing.
Yeah. Rufus, when you started to do the EP, was it just a matter of, say, I've got a few mates here, let's phone them up, or this, or how did you actually? I mean, I'm not a musician, so I don't know how you pull an EP together. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to say is you've got an idea, you want an EP, but there's a lot between that and actually, there it is, sort of thing. And can you just talk us a little bit about how you did that?
Yes, a year of pulling my hair out. That was the main part of making the EP. I've got to say, must have sent hundreds and hundreds of emails, and trying to bring a crew of entirely trans and non-binary artists together is worse than herding cats. Like, sorry to everyone in our community, but it is so hard.
Yeah.
Like I say that with love, but my God, also the grey in my hair. But I mean, I think that's a really good question because, I guess the first gig, there was like an element of just twisting the arm of anyone that I could to come and play. But still already we were bringing in, music from Sarah Hennies, who's, quite a well-known composer in America, film piece by a couple of German artists, a piece by the Irish, non-binary singer and composer Robbie Blake. So it was already quite a sort of wide international circle. So in a way, the EP was like a smaller community because I wanted it to be all folk who were in Scotland. Sorry, Viv, you were the cheat. I started out from the point of view of bringing in Scottish and Scotland-based artists because I guess a lot of things that you see that are sort of trans and non-binary, if they're made in the UK, they're often happening in London. It's easy to feel like cut off from that world. So I guess I wanted to try and find all the people in Scotland who are doing that kind of work. And then I spent about 2 months on Google, on Bandcamp, on SoundCloud, on Instagram, on YouTube, and just like listened to so much stuff. I have like a master Rolodex of every trans, non-binary, and gender diverse creative that I came across during this search, like what kind of mediums they work in, what kind of music they make, any links that I have, and just like sleuthed because I wanted to just know, like, yeah, I didn't want to just ask my friends to do this project. I wanted to like find out people who are out there and learn about that. And yeah, then it was very lucky that Sound of Music were interested in the project because they're sort of taking it seriously and saying like, yes, this is important, kind of let me make other people take it seriously too. And so then I was able to get some money from Creative Scotland. Full disclosure, that was like another 3 weeks of writing many thousands of words on an application form and crunching numbers in my sleep. And then, yeah, I guess starting to write to folks and talk to people about the idea. And it took a while, and it was quite sort of emotionally draining as well to like to sort of, if you're organizing something creative, especially if it's really coming from your own practice and your own like work, like a lot of sort of life and creative effort went into it beyond like the writing of the applications. So you're like trusting people with quite a lot when you do that, and just like sort of balancing that with like having very open-ended conversations and saying to people like, this is a space, this is what I can offer you, and like you can do more or less anything that you like within that. And then like starting those conversations with Harry Josephine Giles, with Malin Lewis, who's non-binary piper from Skye, who it turned out lived 2 doors down from me, and with Matthew Arthur Williams, who also lives only a few streets from where I used to live. It was very funny, like discovering this network that had existed, but I hadn't like, found it before. And that makes it sound like everyone's just in the south side of Glasgow, and that I did just, but that's not true. We're like all over Scotland, and beyond. So, and then there was like quite a lot of waiting and feeling anxious. And I guess, a lot of sort of, just the like the emotional effort of sort of getting in touch with people and checking in and trying to get everything happening when it needs to happen is really, especially when you're in lockdown by yourself in the Highlands, that's actually like really quite draining. So I don't really know how it came together, I guess is what I'm saying. Like, a dozen very talented creative people and many hundreds of emails would be the short answer.
Fantastic. Well, let's listen to some music from it, I guess, next, and I think we're going to start by listening to Matthew Arthur Williams and Rylan Gleaves' piece "Feels." And so maybe Rylan, you'd like to say a little bit about the piece and introduce it to us.
Yeah, I do want to say that it is not my piece in any way whatsoever. This is absolutely Matthew's piece. So the recording of my vocals came from the project that Rufus was talking about, Healens. And Matthew, I think, asked Rufus to use some of the... Am I right in thinking that Matthew asked you to use some of the...
Yeah, because Matthew's like, I approached him having heard his stuff as a DJ and just thinking that they had a very like musical approach to their sets. And I just kind of said, like, do you do any producing? And maybe making a piece from scratch is not the right thing for you, but if a remix was the right thing, then here's the material and go forth. So yeah.
Yeah, and I absolutely love what they have done with it. Like, it's stunning. It sounds absolutely fantastic, and it is not a direction that I ever would have thought those vocals specifically would have gone in. But it really, really works, and I absolutely love it. But yeah, it's not my piece. I'm definitely not qualified to talk about it like that.
Okay. Well, we're going to hear your vocals along with the other music on it. So let's take a listen. So that was Matthew Arthur Williams and Ryland Gleave with Feels. Jacob, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is this was the first one I listened to, the first one of the three that we're going to listen to today, and it immediately brought me into this really interesting, like I was saying earlier, like soundscape world and kind of understanding of how that sound group gets created. So it's really interesting to me to hear that you didn't compose it with the vocals in mind, and that they were kind of interacted with in a different way, and that Matthew's more of a DJ producer type person. So like that has really fascinated me, that those vocals are not where you thought they would go, and now I'm really fascinated to hear where you thought they would go without Matthew's interaction from it.
I mean, I don't know if you've heard Rufus's piece, He Lands, He Lands. If not, I would recommend listening to it, because it is really a gorgeous collection of trans squeaks. It's stunning, and it's so weird. I guess like recording those.
I've heard it, and I will back that up. It is it's maybe we'll have to come back to that one sometime. Maybe that's when we invite you back on in a few months or something. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess just from the original recordings, like they came from such a strange place, because I think I was maybe 8 or 9 weeks into taking testosterone, and my voice was just splitting and cracking everywhere, and I couldn't sing a single note. Like I had maybe 3 notes in my range, and the rest of it was just garbage. And instead of feeling sorry for myself, Rufus was like, "You want to work on a piece?" And I was like, "Yes, absolutely. Let's be distracted by the fact that I can't sing anything." And actually, like with hindsight, they're so gorgeous. They sound fantastic. And I'm really pleased that I've retained the ability to make my voice do that when I want, as opposed to that just being a thing that was that one chapter in time. Like I can kind of bring that back in different pieces, which is, useful as a composer who works with voices. But I guess I hadn't, because that was such a bare and exposed kind of set of vocals that went into that piece. I guess I hadn't imagined them in such an immersive soundscape that Matthew created, with the kind of accompaniment and the beat behind it, but they fit so beautifully with it. Yeah, Matthew's skill in that area is just immense.
And it would be really interesting to me to hear, like almost like variations on it, like, and have your vocals with multi-beats, and then see what other people do, or see what Matthew would come back and, how long ago was this actually recorded? Like when, like 8-10 months ago?
Oh, Rufus, when was the first one?
Autumn 2019.
Oh,
was
wow,
it?
okay.
Autumn 2018.
It was 2018, because then we came back and I responded to them with
Like
a slightly deeper voice.
Yeah. 2018.
Gosh.
2018. Like, it would be interesting to do that every year kind of thing, like come back in 2020, 2021, 2022, even if just to hear where the progression goes, or where the idea of beat and pulse and soundscape and how the vocals might interact differently, or fascinating.
I mean, Rufus, if you're taking more commissions, I will happily we can do a few more of them.
I think it's funny, Rylan, that you think that that it's like a surprising direction, because in a way it's like the piece that I wish that I could make from those vocals. Like I guess like for whatever reason, like when I'm inside the music, it just didn't like go in that direction. But like, yeah, I love that, like that there are so many, because I've got like hours and hours of you singing, and of Ben and Ronan singing as well, and like must be like 6 hours of material, and like we've only used a tiny little piece of it. There must be so many other pieces of music like inside that, and as well, the sort of it's lucky that Matthew is so generous, because this was originally it was like a sketch that he put in the shared Google Drive that we had when we were like talking about the project, and I just listened to it and was like it really just sort of struck something for me, because it was like just Rylan singing the word beautiful, and I was like, yeah, that's basically like the sum of the project, like it's beautiful, like, and yeah, I like that the beats sort of add a different way to like embody it, and I like that people, like when we did my PC lands, like the people who were playing it would come away and be like singing fragments that Rylan was singing in the recording, even though like they're not that, like they're like weird splitting little modal melodies. They're not like catchy pop tunes, but like people would come away with them as like earworms and be like singing them. And it's like, it's worked. The evil scheme has worked. But yeah, it's just it's nice to have something that's kind of like, it's not like straightforwardly joyful, but something that is like, that does have like that joy in it to sort of bring things into the round in the EP, I think.
I must admit, when I listen to it, I mean, you've got this sort of, back music to the voice that's quite sort of incessant and it goes on, but it's kind of relaxing in a way. I find that relaxing. And then you've got this, I wrote down the word ethereal, that's just me, sort of voice on top of it. And sometimes it sort of went like positive, if you know what I mean. It sort of reinforced each other, and it's sort of like you got a certain feeling. Then sometimes it felt almost like it was working against each other. And it was almost like sometimes it felt like a little bit uncomfortable, and then it got sort of more comfortable again, then it got a little bit uncomfortable again, and it was this continual change in and out that kept it sort of moving for me. I don't know if that makes sense. It was a continual sort of like, it didn't ever settle down into something. It always had a movement to it.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think that's a lot of how I felt about it as well. I probably wouldn't have realized it was only one vocal loop. I might have thought it was like lots of little different ones. But I saw the session and I saw that it was a loop. But yeah, it feels like that. It feels like it's always changing just a little bit.
So I think it's time we moved on to the next piece. Now we have Harry Josephine Giles and Vivian Holmes with Out of Existence Part 1, AGP.
Shit, it's really gold mine. Something I have to work. Eventually, I'll give myself a full second. You know, I start to think your passion. You know what I mean? The ultimate beauty being that's metal. The deep beauty being the let's ugly places and places. That's time to climb. No, fight, China, no, fight, China,
So Vivian, would you like to tell us a little bit about the piece?
Yeah, well this is, just the general context of like Out of Existence. So Out of Existence comes from Janice Raymond, which one? One of those. Like the transsexual empire, the whole, Uber turf thing, being like, oh, we have to legislate trans women out of existence. Love that, love to hear that. And like, Josie's work, I was a big fan of Josie like before I was approached for it, so I was like, oh, I get to work with her? She's a fucking genius. Yes, please. And and that was like a lot of what we were talking about when Josie was just sort of explaining like her ideas about what she was thinking. Was this like what is it? because it uses a combination of, there's AGP, which comes from your like Ray Blanchard, like more
and it's autogynephilia for those people who don't know what AGP means. We might have some people who don't know. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and so that came from like the like pseudoscientific work of psychologist Ray Blanchard, who sort of defined your like two types of trans women of being the autogynephile and the homosexual transsexual, of being the and the sort of a gynephile, but a whole thing, transphobia in science, in everything in society, and everything transmisogyny specifically, and it's just using terms like autogynephilia, which is that like it's a sort of Greek term being like getting basically sort of like being a trans woman and specifically being a trans woman is attracted to other women is a sort of just basically a fetish, and that's and so it's like, oh, you're turned on by the idea of thinking yourself as a woman, and it's like, well, if you think about that, like everyone, like most women do that, like that's sort of like how sex and gender relations and having sex and gender relations works. But yeah, the whole thing about the piece is like using all these terms. There's, so it's AGP comes from pseudoscientific stuff in the 80s. GID is sort of slightly later on. TIM is a term that like modern TERFs use. Egg is a term that like your very online trans women use about themselves. And GIA, like, again, just sort of like modern trans discourse, and they're actually using all these like terms that come from different like ways that people talk about trans women, like both from being transphobic and transmisogynistic, and like trans women talking about themselves. And so like that's the sort of overarching thing of the whole piece, talking about that. And then also incredibly important is all the quotes, which come largely from trans literature. I think Josie is primarily a poet, and so that's what's coming from. For example, in HB specifically, this includes a quote from Sarah Ahmed, in which she's talking about Heidegger, which I love. I wrote my master's thesis on Heidegger, and it was just this, the hammering, the hammer as like the tool. The hammer is a tool for hammering, and and that's very much about like how this combination of like language and perception and phenomenology comes about to sort of bring together the ways in which like sort of you understand the world. And Heidegger's sort of phenomenology, Heidegger's sort of idea of like the Dasein sort of world space is like, using the ways that we sort of interpret the thing about the world and tools and objects and the self. And his big thing, Heidegger was sort of fundamentally sort of anti-dualist, in which it's like there's no distinction between the self and the world, and the language that we use to, and then sort of stuff about the language that we use to talk about the world and how we interact with the world, and it's very much it's all mold in with each other. And I think that, like, I don't know, being a big fan, I saw that, and saw specifically like Sarah Ahmed's like quoting of that, and I was like, yes. This is it. This is a piece for me.
Mm.
And a lot of this was we had a really long talk at the start just about like how, because I think, it's sort of that sort of, it is fundamentally like sort of interesting in that like in comparison to like specifically looking at, in comparison with fields and in comparison with that sort of idea and the like trans masculine voice cracking, versus the like trans woman on estrogen, which like the voice has to be like physically like wrenched upwards. And we were talking about using artists like Laura Les from 100 Gex, who specifically is like pitching her voice up in basically every song. Sophie, rest in peace, who died a few months ago. And a lot of her work, she was also doing that using an artificially raised voice, using vocalists and stuff. Versus someone like Laura Jane Grace, who, just sings like she'd always sung.
Yes.
But inherently different, which is that interesting about like what Ruthless was saying about how that changed. And then you look at like artists like Mickey Blanco, who just is one of those trans women who just like go for like I think she's on hormones. Like I'm never quite sure what. Mickey Blanco's gone back and forth, I think. But but yeah, it's very much like out there and like upfront about like just sort of like, this is my voice, this is what it sounds like, we're doing it. And we decided that like ultimately, because the piece was about exploring the trans voice, we would go for that sort of more exploring the like trans voice as it is, rather than using like vocoders and stuff to change it.
This is always a big thing, I think, for a trans woman, is this voice. What do you do about it? Do you try and pull it up, as you say, and have this voice that you try and do, or do you just let it go back to your normal voice, or how do you deal with it? And I think that's one of the interesting things that I felt about the music, was this sort of questioning there of what you do with your voice. For me, as a trans woman, do I just be what my normal voice, or do I try and make it a very feminine voice? It's kind of an interesting problem for us all, I think.
Exactly. And it was like, it's something I've always wondered. It was like also when I was first like talking to like doctors about like what I wanted from transition. And it's like, I always said that I was a feminist before I was a woman. And that's not just like a rhetorical thing. That's like chronologically specific. And it was talking about like, oh, how do I want to sound? How do I want to be? How do I want to go about the world? To what extent are my desires tied in with like societal expectations? To what degree is my understanding of my own voice tied in with these other things? And to what extent is this just the thing that I want? And like, how can you know what you want?
Yeah.
And I think that's tying into the Heidegger. That's tying into that sort of non-dualist position, in that there's no inherent self. But like they're saying here, that people say her philosophy degree isn't useful. Here's me figuring out my own gender with one. There is no like inherent self. Like there is no like there's no like true desire that what you ultimately want at the bottom of everything. That it's like completely like, if you strip away these layers and layers and layers of like societal pressure and societal like building up of like what it is to be a person, what it is to be a woman, like sort of. And in the same way that like it's hard to define womanhood without misogyny, it's hard to define like trans desire and like what transition looks like outside of transphobia and outside of misogyny. And that's and that's sort of ultimately why we sort of ended up in that sort of place that we did around the piece. And that's how sort of why, in talking about it in that certain way, why we decided to sort of talk about what the trans feminine voice is like as it is. And, I think like that especially comes through in like a lot of these pieces in which I'm just like really straining my voice. Is that like, this is quite a thing like, I have had basically no formal vocal training, like ever, and so like I sometimes do like strain my voice when I'm like playing on my own, because I'm just like, I don't really know what to do. And then, I don't know if you have like Ryland's work in Ashenspire I've been listening to, which is just like, if you don't know, Ryland is in a like black metal band. Black metal, would you call it that? Yeah, there's a name.
I think, we refer to it as theatrical black metal, which is, a little bit over the top, but yes, essentially.
It's camp. And and I think like, especially in that, and I think like, if there's a reason why you find like there's quite a few trans women who like work in sort of black metal and play that sort of thing. I'm looking at artists like Feminazgul, Victory Against the Sun, Liturgy. Like I think like you can sort of see a lot of that because it's in that sort of like extreme world, and it's in that sort of like on the sort of outer edges of like what a vocal is and what vocals sound like. So you sort of find something more interesting. And I've been listening to a lot of Lingua Ignota as well, who's this like incredible like singer who used to do sort of more electronic stuff, and now is moving on to sort of has recently released an album in 2019 called Caligula, which is like, it's just stunningly beautiful. She's cis, but like, you know, it's the thing.
Well, we don't mind. We do. That's fine.
Yeah, they're
It's
okay. I hang
Yeah.
out with them sometimes.
They're okay. Yeah.
Right.
I found when I listen to music, I must admit, I found some of it quite triggering to me, because it's kind of, you know, when I was listening to some of it, it was kind of like reminded me of things that I've had to deal with in my life and that kind of thing. So I found it sometimes quite difficult to listen to. I'll admit that, you know, but I couldn't stop listening to it, but it was difficult to listen to. And Jacob, I'm going to bring you in here, because how did you feel about it? Because, you know, for me, it's a particularly trans woman experience that I had with it. And kind of, how did you feel about it? Because it would be interesting to get a different perspective, I think.
And as a cis man, it obviously doesn't hold the same weight or understanding, and it doesn't feel immediate to me in that way, obviously. But what is really interesting is that, and we talk about this, Sam and I, all the time, and I think this is kind of what we were talking about, Ryland, just before we kind of started the podcast, that there's like an inherent queerness to listening to queer music. That's a weird way of putting that. You can hear like an inherent queerness in queer music that I think still resonates, even if it doesn't resonate in the same way. Like, the text doesn't hold the same weight and understanding for me, but the impetus, or the starting place, or the reason for creation still holds a lot of weight. And I think that is what I feel more viscerally, is that the sound of your voice and how you are creating and how you are putting these things together makes a lot of sense for me, but doesn't hold the same like background weight. But it feels very, I don't want to say, I think you used the word pared down, sparse, clear, crystalline. It felt very clear, if that makes sense. That's my take.
It's kind of interesting, because Jacob and I have been talking quite a lot about, I guess, in the term queer music, and how do we identify that? Because we both feel there is something inherent amongst queer composing musicians which makes their music different, or at least a different feel to it in some way. And so I'd be quite interested in getting your views, the three of you's views on this, because I think Jacob and I have a view on it. Do you feel the same? Do you feel your music has a certain feeling to it? Any one of you?
I'm going to speak on behalf of Rufus and say that I feel Rufus's music has an inherent queerness to it.
Thanks, Rylan. That's very kind of you. This is a great compliment. That's a really hard question. I guess, I guess there's like a lot of things that feed into it, and I'm slightly like overwhelmed by them. Like, I guess, sorry, I'm like trying to choose a thread to pull on, and it was all like tangled up.
Sorry, I did kind of dump that one on you.
Oh, I'm afraid we dumped it on you. Sorry about that. Yeah.
But I guess like a lot of what like I've talked about with Overat is this thing about the voice, and I do mean like singing voices, speaking voices, other kinds of voices, but then when you get off the end of other kinds of voices, like maybe other ways of communicating verbal information, or it might be going over into things that are non-verbal, and it might be going over into your voice being to do with how you draw or play an instrument, or maybe you write words on a page, and that there are a lot of ways to sort of have a voice. And I guess as someone who has never been a singer, but has become quite highly trained as a musician, it's sort of tempting to think that, like, I play the viola, it's tempting to think like the viola's kind of like my voice, has a very similar range to my voice, just technically. Like, basically that's all the notes that I can sing there on that instrument, and that's partly why I play it. Or like, you know, maybe like the bass is more like my voice, and I want to like imagine it as this like big, heavy, rooting thing, or like, all these things. But I think for me, like, the thing that I've learned that's kind of let me find a way into making music again after a period of not being able to make music at all, is like that the way that I write music on the page, that kind of is my voice. And like, being really trying to be like extremely honest about what that voice is first, and then trying to be really accepting of it also, and see like, okay, that's what my voice is like, where am I trying to hide it, and where am I like saying something that's more true. And so then if, like, for me going forward in that way, like, how could it not be a trans voice? How could it not be a queer voice? Because it's like exactly as trans and as queer as I am, because that's how I've worked. It's like, you know, I've been inside it and done that, and that's, you know, been a way of sort of speaking, in a way. Did that make sense?
It does. I mean, my immediate thought is this. I don't know if you read like Donna Haraway, like this intense, you cannot piece apart positionality and direction of voice, that you speak from the body and life you lead. And of course, it is then ingrained in everything that we do as artists, that any part of what we create is part of that embodied lived experience from which we are coming from. Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me.
All kinds of embodied forms in different pieces that embody different ways, and you have different needs in each one. And yeah.
So let me dump Rylan in it now, because when Rylan immediately said that Rufus's music was queer. So what is it for you, Rylan, that signifies that? Why did you say that? Because you were very clear on this straight away.
Yeah, I guess I've never heard music, any piece of music that sounds like Rufus's music other than Rufus's music. It's just totally singular.
Yeah.
And Rufus, do forgive me for saying this, but I do feel like it's an acquired taste. There is certainly an amount of like thinking about it and understanding it that you kind of have to do. And I'm very privileged that Rufus sends me things in progress and goes, "This is what I'm working on." I'm like, "Ooh, a sneak peek into the next release." But I think once you start then looking at it and thinking about it, it's tied to so many things. There are so many connections in it that, like, I feel wouldn't be the case if it wasn't coming from that incredibly introspective place that you kind of have to be as a queer person. And yeah, there's so many references to so many wonderful other things. And yeah, just the kind of the way that it's conducted, and then even the final product, the way that it sounds, the way that the performance directions are communicated is so different and so precious in so many ways. And I won't keep gushing, Rufus, because it's probably very embarrassing for you. But yeah, it does. It sounds queer, and I really love that about it. I think it's a very unique sound. You know, if you're going to play some of Rufus's music now, I would recommend just a little piece of Rufus music.
Yeah, I think we'll have to do that, because I must admit I played a bit on the radio show, and it does elicit some interesting responses from people, and it is one of those things that you have. Again, I'm sorry if I'm embarrassing you, but you have to listen to a lot, because as you start to listen to it, at least from my perspective, it suddenly starts to open up. You know what I mean? It's when you first listen to it, it sounds sort of like it's quite closed, or it's not kind of clear. But the more you listen to it, it suddenly starts to get deeper and deeper and more layered, I guess I would say, in some way. And it's kind of interesting because it's I don't know, it's kind of, I can't even think of the word. It's kind of this sort of very oh yeah, you're going to have to help me out. I'm afraid I got lost on the words here. I don't even know how to explain it really. It's kind of a very, as you said, unusual sound to it, and it sort of draws you in, and you experience things with it. I don't know. Maybe that sounds a bit.
Oh, I am like a little embarrassed, but also like I think it's true that, like, you know, I understand how the like, oh, it's an acquired taste could sound like an insult, but it's kind of been something that I've needed to build into the music all the time, is like, there is a barrier, like when I'm writing and kind of like putting up different like layers, and you could stop at the outside and be like, okay, that was the piece. And you could like sort of choose to go further into it. But like, there's definitely an aspect of like in the first piece that I wrote after sort of coming back to music, the sort of top line on it was like something like, this piece is exploring bodies and stories that are totally close to you, and I kind of wanted to like acknowledge that for myself outright, that like, yeah, this is like this is something that you don't know and you can't see, if that makes sense. Like, it needed to be like, this piece is like a complete body, in some way. I don't know. So yeah, trans. Super trans.
I think, yeah, there's something very trans about very inaccessible music. I always feel like there's this, you know, I brought it up before about this. There's this essay called "The Sex Close to Noise" by this one called Leah F., who just like writes about trans women in noise music, talking about like Genesis Porridge, and just sort of a lot of those sort of histories around that. And you know, my greatest gig is the one where I made the sound guy leave, because it was just sort of like a wall, and but there were like 5 people standing in the front having the fucking time of their lives, and it was just like, that just sort of feels very, you just sort of show up and it's just like, hi, this is a horrifying beast, and then like there's a few people who just think it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and I don't know, that I love that, and that always feels very trans to me.
And it feels so satisfying. It feels so. We were also talking about this earlier, that if all of our main goals can be to have an audience just feel something visceral, then that is all I ever need. And like this idea of like 5 people who feel something very intensely, then that matters more than the, you know, however many people could be there. I would much rather go to a show, or much rather do a show where 5 people think that is the most important thing they've ever experienced in their entire life, and then have the sound guy leave. That's phenomenal to me. I think that makes so much sense.
I mean, we were talking about a little bit earlier about you know, the radio show that I do, that you know, I play a lot of typical classical music that everyone loves, because they love the classical music, and it's great. Everyone sits there and you play a piece of Mozart, and I mean, who doesn't like Mozart? You listen to Mozart and it's a great piece of music. But it's like, most people are like, oh, it's a great piece of music, you know, fantastic, but they're not really terribly engaged with it. It's Mozart, you know, and they've heard it. And then I play a piece of music from a modern trance composer, say, and immediately there's this reaction. It's either wow, that's incredible, or it's like, oh no, that's terrible, you know. And I can't. How's that? Not in this kind of thing. But the fact is, it's that reaction that they're actually listening to it now, as opposed to just having it as this background. And it's kind of great fun to actually, to put a piece like that against a piece of Mozart in the radio show. And people are like, took on the Mozart, and the next piece you've got, wow, this other thing. And it's like they go, oh, what's happened to me? What's going on? And it's kind of fun. It's kind of shocking, but it engages people as opposed to just playing the same old stuff, which is just noise. You know, I know it's terrible. I don't mean Mozart like that. I'm sorry. You know what I mean.
Yeah, but then you can like hear the Mozart again and hear that it's got its own world as well. Like you might forget otherwise. So yeah, I definitely think that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. You've got, you know, there's, I must admit, when I've learned a lot off of listening to modern trans composers and other modern queer composers, because when I started, I was very much of playing the traditional classical music. And it's kind of good, but it kind of like gets kind of, I don't want to use the monotonous, but it kind of gets, you know, into the same routine all the time. And so when I started playing the other music, I suddenly learnt a lot, because it suddenly, how to get reactions from people, which is something I didn't know music could do, because I'm not a musician. Yet that's something you guys have been talking about, how you get reactions from your music. And so I had to learn it that way, but it's something which seems natural to you. And that to me is sort of, well, it's in a little way, it's a little bit annoying that I didn't understand that, but it's an interesting learning experience.
Yeah, and it's always amazing to hear about how other people respond, because like it is different for everyone. Everyone's coming from a different place. So of course we've all got a different way of like coming to those pieces and those feelings.
I'm going to just sort of jump in here. I'm cognizant we've been going for an hour already, and our whole podcast is an hour, and we've only listened to 2 pieces of music. So, I mean, is everybody okay if we just do the 2? Is that okay? Discuss those rather than do the third, because I think otherwise we're going to be an hour and 20, and I think it's getting a bit long.
Yes.
I don't want to sort of stop the conversation, because I think it's actually really, really positive. So.
I mean, whatever is best for you is
a
good thing.
I think because I think it's really, it's quite exciting. I kind of want to go on for longer, but I know we have got to, you know, fit it into a period of time. So, Jacob, what else do we need to? Is there anything else we need to talk about at the moment, do you think, or discuss, or anything else we'd like to get over?
I think I don't think there's any big major thing we need to throw in, and I think doing 2 of the 3 is great. I think time-wise that probably we have plenty of material to kind of work through. It's really, these are like such beautiful conversations to have, and I always value when we can have these like times just talking with people who have such a like wonderful view on creation of classical music. It's for those of us who are like stupidly rigidly classically trained, it's so nice to be able to talk about everything else and have this time to talk about, you know, what we'll like broadly call classical music, as in it's within a, you know, classical-ish world, but understand the different like abilities to subvert that understanding of what classical music can be, and how important it is to have classical music exist within like a trans voice, but also have classical music exist in so many various snapshots of where it sits day to day with individual people, but also within the larger, broader conversation of what classical music can be. And so I'm just so thankful to have this time with the 3 of you, well, 4 of you with Sammy, but 3 of you to talk about your views on creation and how you think about creating. And Vivian, it's so interesting to hear that you are coming at this from like a punk side, because it absolutely translates to me. It absolutely makes perfect sense to think about, again, broadly classical music through a trans-punk lens. Of course, that's a conversation that has a really beautiful outcome. Like, your pieces are beautiful. Like, that's such an interesting way to attack classical music. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the thing, I just find the whole thing terribly exciting. I mean, it's kind of because I think part of it is that I don't know what's coming next. I think that's part of it for me, is that the pieces are so different, and that every time I listen to something, that when I talk to one of you and I see a new piece, it is different, and it kind of elicits a whole new set of responses. And this is something that Jake and I have talked about before, that this is something that I think queer musicians do more than anyone. They do this kind of really, ability to I don't use the word metamorphosize, but I don't mean that, but be able to change the way they respond to the world, and you hear that in the music. And so it's always very exciting. So for me, that's kind of as a listener to music, as opposed to a musician, that's what I want, is something that actually, I look forward to wanting to hear what the next piece is.
I always tell the university kids, when I'm teaching about, why do we study the arts? Why do we study classical music? And, part of it is that classical music, or music in general, and the arts in general, gives us this vocabulary to understand and deal with complex situations, that we have this understanding of art creation so that we can express so many different complex things. And if you then layer on a queer lens to that, it just deepens it tenfold, that queer people immediately have to adapt and change and have a much more complex view of the world from day one. And then if we map that into the arts, of course, then the creation of queer people and trans composers and trans performers is just so much more fluid and adaptive and interesting and complex, and that's the beauty. That's why we're talking about it. It's great.
If I may, I think it's amazing as well to be like in a Skype room, but in a room with a group of queer musicians and listeners, because that was part of the sort of overall goal as well, that it's not only the creators, but also that the music is for trans, non-binary, and otherwise gender diverse folk, and more broadly queer folks. And I felt like when you're only in a conversation in a room of all entirely otherwise cis people, then the queerness in your music can get lost if you don't have someone who can listen to it and engage with it. So it's been like really amazing to have an audience with Overat that is such a huge percentage of trans and binary folk, to sort of be the other side of the conversation and listen and hear the queerness and hear the transness as well, because that's like we were saying before we started, like the community in which you're making that music is really important as well. Who listens?
Absolutely. We do obviously have such a, even within the broader queer community, we have such a terrible habit of not holding space specifically for any group, but specifically for trans, non-binary, gender diverse composers and musicians and people even within the queer community, let alone outside the queer community. It's so nice to hear about Overat holding that space really intentionally, and holding that space to, I love the way you put it, for listeners and performers and creators, but ingesters of music in all forms, that all parts of that continuum are important to understand the other parts. Thanks again for listening to the Classical Queer podcast. We hope you enjoyed the music and conversation with the people at Over At. We're looking forward to bringing you the next podcast soon. Also, many thanks to Jared Miller for all the incidental music we are using. Until next time.